Now it is time to discuss the day's political issues. Joining me is Ebony Bennett from the Australia Institute and Emily Dye from the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. Hello to you both. Let's get straight into it. Big news on Friday. Donald Trump and Melania Trump diagnosed with COVID-19. Today he has released a video saying that he is doing well. Ebony, what do you think this means for the Trump campaign?
It's hard to say at this point. It could go either way, frankly. Donald Trump certainly has a history of turning things around for his campaign and using them to his advantage. And I don't think anyone is necessarily shocked that he's contracted this disease that he has treated so cavalierly up until this point. But I do think people are now speculating about what will happen if he gets seriously ill or, in fact, in a worst-case scenario, even dies, and the implications of that for the American presidency and for the election itself. And I think one of the things that will happen is that people will take a closer look at the vice presidential candidates. Both the presidential candidates are older. Donald Trump's certainly not very healthy either. I think in terms of both of those campaigns, you would have to say that Kamala Harris is a much more effective candidate for the Biden campaign than I think people who are attracted to Trump will find Mike Pence to be for the Trump camp. As much personality as a cardboard box compared to Donald Trump.
Well, you do raise a good point. We still don't exactly know what level of illness he has contracted. We don't know the status of his health at this stage. Emily, what sort of an impact do you think this will have on the election?
Well, if we thought 2020 couldn't get any worse, it just did.
Exactly.
So this is terrible for the American people, terrible for the election. I don't think this isn't good news for anyone. I'm really concerned for the state of the American people and the state of the United States should the virus get worse and should Trump have the worst possible case happen. It would go to Pence, most likely as his replacement in a campaign. So it would be an interesting question, though that does not necessarily decided. The Republican Party would have to choose a candidate, but most likely it would be Pence.
Yeah, well, as we said, we don't know exactly medical-wise, but perhaps we might find out in the coming days. Let's go back home now. Of course, we know the federal budget will be handed down on Tuesday. Ebony, it's been called the jobs budget, and today it was revealed that forecasts will be based on the assumption that a coronavirus vaccine will be discovered. We are in a recession at the moment, though. How important will job creation be?
It is the most important thing. During a recession, we need absolutely every taxpayer dollar to be working as hard as possible to create more jobs and reduce the unemployment rate. And that's why it's so disappointing to hear that it sounds like confirmation the government will be bringing forward stages 2 and 3 of its income tax cuts package that is already legislated. The Australia Institute has new research out today showing that if we instead invested that money from bringing forward the stage 2 tax cuts into health, education, those types of services industry, we could create around between 7 and 12 times the number of jobs that we'll get from these income tax cuts, which are targeted largely at the wealthiest Australians who need the least help at the moment. And the bottom 50% of income earners really miss out. They only get 3 to 4% of the benefit of bringing these income tax cuts forward. So it's very ineffective in terms of stimulus, as wealthier people are more likely to save their incomes, and that's not that we need to be doing during a recession. We need them to be spending that money in the economy, and that's why these income tax cuts, I think, are a terrible idea. And also, they mostly benefit men. About 70% of the benefit of the income tax cuts will go to men and only about 30% to women. And we know women have really borne the brunt of this recession so far. So really disappointing to hear that.
Yeah, income tax cuts, certainly one of the big keys of this budget. Also, Emily, manufacturing. The federal government saying the other day that they're really turning to the manufacturing sector to prop out of this recession. Do you think that goes far enough? Is that the key, really, to get us out of this?
Well, I think the key is more jobs, both in manufacturing and across the broader economy. Income tax cuts are a great way of doing that. It allows people to have more money in their pockets and then more money to then spend in the economy. Tax cuts are one part of fiscal stimulus, and I think we really do need to stimulate the economy through those tax cuts. And I just want to address what Ebony said about women not getting as much of this tax cut. I think it's worth noting that women have generally are more sensitive to tax increases than men, and so they're more likely to stay home as a result of higher taxes than a man. So by lowering those tax brackets, or by allowing them to have lower taxes and making it so that those tax brackets are increased, that actually helps women substantially. When it comes to manufacturing, I can just throw money at the manufacturing sector and expect that to fix our problem. We've had a history of a problem in manufacturing. We lost Holden long before coronavirus.
Yeah.
And that has a lot to do with high taxes and a lot of regulations. So we need to really rethink...
High gas prices, too.
Yeah, we need to rethink the manufacturing from the ground as opposed to just throwing money at it and expecting it to be fixed.
Yeah, and I guess another question is, in this current climate, how many manufacturing jobs are currently out there? So we'll be looking to Tuesday with eager eyes, that's for sure. Now, let's discuss the border situation. This week, the WA Premier Mark McGowan suggested that keeping the state's border closed would force people to spend money at home. Ebony, we know that the borders have always been based on health advice. Do you think comments like this could be perhaps bordering into the unconstitutional?
Well, I'm no constitutional lawyer, but I do know most of the state premiers feel pretty good on border closures because they remain popular with the public. They feel like they've had a big impact on keeping coronavirus under control in the community. And, whether or not the government tries to take this to the High Court again, and as it did intervene previously or indicate it would do so in the case of WA, but none of the other states that have maintained hard borders, remains to be seen. But I think all the state premiers, including Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk, who I think has announced in Queensland that those borders will open based on meeting some health conditions after the election.
Yes.
I mean, I think premiers would be a bit crazy to try and open their borders too soon and risk the kind of second wave that we saw in Victoria. So I think they'll all be moving forward with an abundance of caution and really ignoring this type of pressure from the federal government. But we do need to work towards opening the borders. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But the community has to feel safe doing so.
You raise a good point. It's the popularity of these decisions. We've seen it in Western Australia and as well in Queensland. These are popular decisions in both states to keep the borders closed. Emily, do you think that Mark McGowan's comments here, though, could backfire? Is he coming under more pressure?
I don't think we should be keeping the borders closed for economic reasons. There's been huge opportunity costs from having these border closures, particularly for communities right along those borders. It's been devastating to people both on a health level where they can't reach the nearest hospital and on an economic level where they cannot cross that border to get their basic necessities or to trade with people on the other side of the border as they would normally. So the costs are very high of keeping these borders closed.
Yeah, and I guess we won't know the full cost perhaps for another 12 to 18 months. Just finally, a quick word from both of you because we are running out of time. The Aged Care Royal Commission report was handed down this week. It found a litany of preparedness for a pandemic. Ebony, where do we go from here? The government has certainly accepted all of the recommendations, but are major reforms needed to correct the systemic failures?
Major reforms are definitely needed to correct systemic failures. There's going to need to be more funding, more regulation, and the inquiry called for a comprehensive plan for the aged care sector to deal with coronavirus. That's an indictment on the federal government to get that call or that recommendation this many months into the pandemic. The government said that it had one. Obviously, if it did have a plan, it was a failure. So much more is going to need to be done. And I think anyone who called for Health Minister Jenny Mikakos to resign in Victoria will be a hypocrite if they're not also calling for Minister Colbeck to resign over the failures from his government department that manifestly has failed the aged care sector and every Australian who has a parent or a loved one care today.
Emily, has it taken too long to address what were already systemic issues?
I think we really needed to address these issues, particularly with the locking down of aged care and not allowing the elderly to see their families and their friends. This is pretty much inhumane. These people are at the end of their life, and we're at a time when every minute counts. And I don't think we really took that into consideration in the aged care sector. One size really does not fit well with every facility, every family, or every individual patient. I think that we need to really allow more flexibility on the part of the individual to make choices for themselves.
Yeah, it's certainly been really sad to see a number of these stories as well. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Ebony Bennett and Emily Dye, I appreciate you joining me this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.